I'm Elara, and if you've ever felt like your life was less about living your own truth and more about performing for an audience, then you already understand the first 32 years of my life. For me, wealth wasn't a blessing. It was a beautifully polished, very expensive cage. We lived in Beacon Hill, right in the heart of Boston, in one of those classic colonial revival homes with the meticulously maintained black shutters and perfect window boxes. My father, Clark, was a finance executive, and my mother, Vivian, juggled 3 prestigious charity boards. From the outside, we were the picture of success, featured in Architectural Digest twice. We had the Nantucket summer home, the private school tuition, the designer clothes, everything money could buy. But the one thing I desperately needed, which was autonomy, was never on the inventory list. In our family, money was never just currency. It was a sophisticated mechanism of control, power, and manipulation, usually masked as parental foresight. I learned this contract early. When I was in 7th grade, all I wanted was to join the school's photography club. I loved the way a lens could frame a messy world into something clear and intentional. I brought it up over a Sunday brunch, trying to sound mature. My mother, Vivian, didn't yell. She deployed that signature tight, perfect smile, the kind that never reached her eyes. "Darling, we don't waste time on pointless hobbies," she said, cutting into her eggs Benedict. "Your father pays over $70,000 a year for your education at Windsor. That money buys future, not idle time playing with a camera." Instead, I was enrolled in advanced debate and French tutoring, skills that would make me marketable to the right people. Every single gift came with a meticulously knotted string. My 16th birthday present was a stunning Audi convertible. You can imagine the envy from my friends. But when my father handed me the keys, he made sure to mention, "The registration is in my name, Elara. This way, we can quickly retrieve it if your grades ever slip below an A-, or if you make inappropriate choices." I nodded and smiled, a practiced reflex. I understood the unspoken agreement, luxury in exchange for absolute obedience. It was a contract I thought I'd signed for life. I spent my youth being groomed for a life that wasn't mine. My mother was obsessed with legacy, my father with status. My college application process was less about my aspirations and more about maintaining the family tradition. Harvard, Yale, Princeton. My application essay, my voice, was edited until it was unrecognizable, replaced by what Mother called appropriate ambition. When the acceptance letter from Dartmouth arrived, a school dad's connections and our significant donations had all but guaranteed. My parents threw a celebratory dinner where I felt less like a daughter and more like a trophy to be displayed. "She'll graduate and join Clark at the firm," Mother announced, radiating pride while holding a crystal glass. I just stood there, my cheeks aching from the forced smile, feeling that suffocating weight of predetermined destiny settle over me. I excelled in my classes, business and economics, naturally, but every A grade felt like another rivet hammered into the walls of my gilded cage. I was excelling at someone else's life, and the quiet desperation was starting to scream inside my head. My roommate, Tara, was the first one to really notice. She'd watch me stare at the art students sketching on the campus green, or the journalism majors running around with their equipment, and she finally suggested, "Why not just take a photography elective? It's Dartmouth, Elara, not a prison sentence." The thought was terrifying, yet it sparked a thrill I hadn't felt in years. But fear won. Every time I called home, Dad's first and only question was about my finance scores. The idea of admitting I had a desire outside of their plan was too dangerous. By the end of my sophomore year, The anxiety and depression were so profound the campus health center prescribed medication. The psychiatrist, a kind woman named Dr. Chin, gently hinted that perhaps my chosen path wasn't authentically aligned with my spirit. I politely accepted the prescription, knowing deep down that changing course wasn't an option. The sheer magnitude of my financial dependency, tuition, rent, allowance, was a crushing force. It seemed impossible to challenge the two people who held all the keys. But what I didn't know was that while my parents were meticulously constructing my prison, one quiet, unassuming man was laying the groundwork for my escape. And he wasn't doing it with protest, but with a pen and a discreet financial portfolio. He was the only person who truly understood that real wealth was freedom, not chains, and his name was Grandpa Arthur. He was about to set in motion a chain of events that would not only grant me that freedom, but utterly shatter the financial control that had defined our family for decades. I just needed to survive the next 2 years until his plan could be executed. I had no idea that my parents were about to deliver the final, brutal insult that would make my choice inevitable. If my parents represented the cold, polished facade of the Williams fortune, Grandpa Arthur was the warm, solid foundation underneath. He was my father Clark's dad, the man who built the entire empire from a small, local manufacturing business into a multi-million-dollar corporation. But unlike Clark and Vivian, Arthur hadn't been corrupted by the sheer spectacle of wealth. He drove a 10-year-old Ford pickup, wore simple, well-made clothes, and spoke to the waitstaff at the local diner with the same genuine respect he showed a CEO. Our monthly visits to his understated, comfortable home in Cambridge were my sanctuary. It felt like walking into a world where the air pressure of expectation was finally released. He never asked about my grades or my mother's latest charity gala success. He would just ask, "So, Elara, what's been giving you fire lately?" When I finally admitted my secret passion for photography, specifically capturing wildlife and natural landscapes, he didn't dismiss it as frivolous. He didn't even mention the $70,000 tuition. Instead, his eyes lit up. He took me to the Museum of Fine Arts to see Ansel Adams exhibits. And for my 17th birthday, he bought me my first professional-grade camera, a Nikon. "Your parents, they believe money is for showing off," he told me once, sitting in his cluttered, cozy study, the kind of room that smelled like old paper and pipe tobacco. He pointed out the window to the sprawling oak tree in his backyard. "But real wealth, honey, is having the freedom to choose your own view of the world. It's the ability to frame your own life." Then he did something my parents would never do. He actually showed me his investment portfolio. Patiently, he walked me through how compound interest worked, how to read a financial statement, the difference between assets and liabilities. He taught me the mechanics of wealth, not for the sake of accumulation, but for the sake of protection. At the time, I thought it was just a nice, eccentric lesson, a sweet old man sharing his trade secrets. I didn't realize he was actually giving me the technical blueprint for my future escape. He was preparing me for a responsibility far greater than I could have imagined. Those early college years at Dartmouth were a constant, desperate battle between the person my parents expected and the person Grandpa Arthur encouraged. After I started the antidepressants, I found myself staring longingly at the Nikon he'd given me, gathering dust in my closet. I'd spend hours scrolling through the old nature photos I'd taken years ago, a hawk in flight, a quiet stream in the autumn fog. Those moments were the only times I felt a flicker of my authentic self. My father's attempts to mold me became even more suffocating as my junior year approached. He'd call not to ask how I was, but to check off a mental list of courses, internships, and networking events. I was a puppet, and the strings were made of silk, but they were strings nonetheless. The only bright spot, the only true support, came during my weekly calls with Grandpa Arthur. I started cautiously sharing my secret desire to pursue photography professionally. I never told him about the medication or the full extent of the family control, but he sensed the tension. "Your grandmother, Elara," he confided one afternoon, his voice soft with distant regret. She was an incredible artist, too, but she gave it up to be the proper wife my generation expected. It was the great, unfixable mistake of her life. Don't you make it yours. He began sending me small checks, ostensibly for better textbooks or professional supplies. He'd add a knowing wink over the phone, and I knew he understood perfectly well that I was using that money for a new lens or a better tripod. He was funding my secret rebellion, and his approval was the oxygen I needed to keep going. My salvation, and the moment that would truly set my fate in motion, came in the form of a required summer study abroad program. It was a business internship focusing on sustainable corporate practices, which made it acceptable to my parents. The itinerary included a 2-week trip to the remote wilderness of Alaska. They allowed me to go only because it would look impressive on the resume. What they didn't know was that I was desperately looking forward to being anywhere, even in the freezing Alaskan wind, as long as it was far from their controlling influence. It was there, amidst the sweeping grandeur of the untouched landscape, that the fragile shell of my obedience would finally begin to crack. And it all started with a chance encounter with a man whose life mirrored the one I was secretly craving. Alaska was a revelation. It wasn't just the sheer, overwhelming scale of the mountains and glaciers. It was the atmosphere of purpose. Our group was visiting a wildlife preserve, and for 2 days we heard lectures on conservation and corporate responsibility. But the true education came from a guest, a documentary photographer named Finn O'Connell, who was there documenting endangered species for National Geographic. Watching Finn work was like seeing my repressed soul finally take a breath. He moved with a quiet, focused reverence, waiting hours in freezing conditions to capture a single shot of a bald eagle fishing or a grizzly bear moving through the salmon stream. His voice, when he spoke about conservation, was raw with passion. He wasn't talking about quarterly earnings. He was talking about purpose, about fighting for something bigger than yourself. On our designated free day, I found myself lingering after his presentation. My official itinerary involved a corporate networking lunch, but I couldn't bring myself to go. Finn noticed me hanging back, fidgeting with my phone. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere but here," he said, his voice low and kind. He had the eyes of a man who spent his life watching horizons. I mumbled something about the lunch being boring. He grinned. "Want to skip it? I'm heading out to try and catch the last light on the Harding ice field. It's brutal terrain, but maybe you can show me what you've been shooting with that camera on your phone." My expensive corporate-approved hiking boots were ruined trudging through marshy tundra that day, but I felt my heart soaring higher than the eagle Finn was trying to track. I spent the entire afternoon silent, just observing his process, his patience, his connection to the natural world. It was a language I finally understood. When we paused for a break, I nervously showed him the few, hastily taken shots I'd managed on my phone, mostly close-ups of wildflowers and some candid shots of a curious sea otter. He went completely still, scrolling slowly through the images. "You have an eye," he said finally, looking up at me, his expression serious. "A rare one. The way you captured the light on that otter's face. There's an unusual emotional depth there. Have you studied photography?" I shook my head, my face heating up as I explained my parents' expectations, the Dartmouth business degree, the future already mapped out for me at my father's firm. I spoke about it with a resignation that surprised even myself. Finn listened without judgment. He reached into his worn leather wallet and handed me a card, a simple card, no gold foil, just his name and an email address. Dartmouth has an excellent visual arts program. You should look into it. Not everyone who takes pictures is a photographer, Elara, but I think you are. Don't waste that truth. I returned to Dartmouth with a secret burning right in the center of my chest. The corporate lunch was forgotten. Finn's words were all I could hear. For 2 weeks, I meticulously researched the photography and journalism program. I realized I could potentially transfer some credits, though it would require a significant shift and, crucially, a face-to-face meeting with the formidable Professor Jocelyn Reed, the head of visual arts. Professor Reed was known for her brutal honesty and high standards. Nervously, I presented my limited portfolio, the photos of the Arctic fox, the sea otter, the old nature shots Grandpa Arthur had encouraged. She studied them, her expression unreadable, before lingering over an image of a lone fox whose eyes seemed to hold a profound, human wistfulness. "These are extraordinary, Miss Williams," she said, her voice sharp with surprise, "especially for someone with no formal training. You capture something most photographers spend years learning to see. You have a gift for emotional narrative." With Professor Reed's unexpected encouragement, I drafted a new academic plan. I was going to tell my parents. I chose Thanksgiving break, thinking the holiday spirit, the presence of extended family, might soften the blow. I was catastrophically wrong. The moment I mentioned changing my major, my mother's fork clattered onto her vintage porcelain plate. My father's face went a shade of terrifying, controlled red I'd never seen before. What followed was an escalating 2-hour confrontation fueled by anger, disbelief, and finally, threats. "We are paying nearly $300,000 for you to become a finance professional," Dad stated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Not to chase squirrels with a camera. Photography is a hobby for bored society wives, not a career for a Williams daughter," Mother added, the tone making it clear which was the worse offense. When I tried to explain the journalism component, the potential for conservation work, my father slammed his hand on the mahogany table. "Enough! If you pursue this ridiculous idea, we will cut you off completely. No tuition, no apartment, no car, no allowance. See how well your camera feeds you then." The ultimatum hung in the air, a devastating silence. I looked at their faces, hardened with the absolute certainty that I would back down. And, as always, I did. Defeated, ashamed, and utterly terrified, I apologized for my temporary insanity and promised to remain focused on the business degree. I flew back to Dartmouth a broken, obedient shell, believing the matter was closed. But I had a secret ace up my sleeve, a fire that had been lit in Alaska that I couldn't extinguish. Thanks to the money and confidence from Grandpa Arthur, I was about to start my secret double life. The confrontation at Thanksgiving had broken my spirit momentarily, but it had also hardened my resolve. My parents, believing they had successfully crushed my rebellion, relaxed their surveillance. This gave me the small window of opportunity one desperately needed. I was defeated but not destroyed. With Professor Reed's continued, quiet support, I secretly enrolled in 2 photography classes the moment the spring semester started, registering them as advanced electives in business communication. On my transcript, a believable cover story for my parents. I covered the tuition and supply fees using the modest savings I had accumulated from Grandpa Arthur's textbook checks and money I earned working late shifts at a small coffee shop off campus. The physical and mental strain of balancing my rigorous business courses with my new, demanding photography program was enormous. I lost weight, subsisted on caffeine, and lived in a constant state of low-grade anxiety about discovery. Yet those 6 hours a week in the darkroom and out on the field felt like the only time I could truly breathe. They were my sanctuary. For 6 hours, I was just Elara, the photographer, learning about composition, light, and the technical poetry of the lens. My projects consistently earned top marks. Professor Reed was relentless, pushing me to develop my unique perspective, capturing the hidden, vulnerable emotional lives of animals and natural spaces. My father called religiously every Sunday night. How are the merger and acquisition case studies coming along, Elara? Are you networking with the right people? I would dutifully report my A grades and career-focused activities, omitting any mention of the thrilling, terrifying hours I spent tracking urban wildlife in the surrounding Massachusetts woods. Then the first breakthrough. By the end of my junior year, I sold my first photograph. It was an image of a shy deer peering through a fence line near the campus, a metaphor for my own caged existence. A small local nature magazine paid me $180. It was a minuscule amount compared to the dividends my parents discussed daily, but I framed that check anyway, hiding it in the back of my closet where my parents would never look. It wasn't about the money. It was proof that my passion had tangible professional value. During my calls with Grandpa Arthur, I finally felt brave enough to confess the full truth of my secret studies. As always, he reacted not with disapproval, but with enthusiastic, genuine pride. "I knew it," he chuckled softly over the phone. "You've got your grandmother's fire. Keep that flame going, Elara." He started sending larger, more substantial checks, always labeled vaguely as support for professional development. He was funding a secret life, and I cherished his complicity. Senior year was a blur. I was living a sophisticated double life. The obedient, finance-track student whom my parents funded, and the emerging, driven photographer I was becoming in stolen hours and hidden darkrooms. The deception was exhausting, but the moments behind the camera, the clarity, the singular purpose, made the risk worthwhile. I was building a portfolio that whispered of a future I was fighting for, even as I prepared to accept the prestigious job my parents had lined up for me. Graduation day arrived with all the pomp and performance my parents cherished. They flew in their friends on the family's private jet, a grand spectacle to witness what Mother called the culmination of our parenting success. I walked across the stage, accepting my honors degree in business, wearing the conservative, expensive dress my mother had selected, feeling like a ghost in my own victory. Professor Reed was there among the faculty, and she gave me a small, sad, knowing smile, a quiet acknowledgement of the talent I had buried. The celebration dinner that evening was at the most exclusive club in Boston. My father ordered a $3,000 bottle of vintage Bordeaux and toasted to my bright, predictable future in finance. I had already accepted a position at Wellington Management, secured by Dad's powerful connections and our family name. No one asked what I wanted. The photographer, the passionate artist, was invisible to everyone but Grandpa Arthur, who had been too ill to attend. I smiled, raised my glass, and played my part, knowing I was walking into a miserable, lucrative prison. The very next morning, while my parents were preoccupied with celebratory brunch plans, I slipped away to visit Grandpa Arthur at his quiet Cambridge home. His health had been declining rapidly, a fact my father handled with the cold detachment of an estate manager, focused only on legalities. When I arrived, I was shocked. The robust man who had taught me to fish and to read the market was frail, almost translucent, confined to a hospital bed set up in his study. "There she is," he whispered, his voice weak, but his eyes still sharp with love. "My favorite granddaughter." "I'm your only granddaughter, Grandpa," I replied, managing a tearful smile, repeating our usual greeting. He squeezed my hand. "Exactly why I've never had to lie about you being my favorite." He motioned for me to lean closer. "I'm not proud of my son, Elara. Clark has forgotten everything I taught him about what truly matters. He thinks bank accounts measure success. I believe happiness does." He waved away my attempt to defend Dad. "I've made arrangements. When I'm gone, you will understand. Just promise me something. Be braver than I was. I gave Clark too much without enough guidance. I won't make that mistake with you." I didn't fully comprehend the weight of his words, but I promised, tears streaming down my face. He held my hand until I left. "Your camera is not just a tool, Elara. It is your voice. Don't let them silence it again." 2 weeks later, I started my job at Wellington, overlooking the Boston Harbor. I was miserable from day one, desperately counting down the minutes until I could escape to the Charles River with my camera. My parents, meanwhile, took my employment as a green light to intensify their control, vetting my dating life, choosing my condo, and subtly reminding me that every advantage I enjoyed was conditional. The unspoken arrangement was clear. In exchange for social privilege, I surrendered my autonomy. But the fragile pieces of my life were about to be shattered by an act of rebellion I could no longer ignore, and it came from a person who offered me a glimpse of the life I was meant to lead. The office at Wellington Management was all gleaming glass, hushed voices, and expensive, conservative suits. The work was mind-numbing, despite its complexity. I was the firm's young, bright talent paraded in client meetings, but rarely given true responsibility. My only escape was the lens. Every evening and weekend, while my colleagues were networking, I was in the Arnold Arboretum or along the coast, desperately capturing moments of natural beauty, a world that felt impossibly distant from my corporate existence. My parents' manipulation only intensified. They insisted I buy a condominium in Beacon Hill, using their money for the down payment to ensure I remained geographically and socially tethered. They vetted every man I dated. When I showed interest in Jordan, a talented architect with middle-class roots, my mother took me aside, her expression one of utter disdain. "Darling, you need to marry within or above our station. We don't date potential. We date established legacy," she explained, as if discussing portfolio risk. The beautiful chains of their control were tightening. 6 months into my gilded misery, I met Liam Scott at a charity gala mother had forced me to attend. Liam was different. He was a journalist covering environmental and humanitarian issues around the globe. While others droned on about hedge funds and mergers, Liam talked about deforestation in the Amazon and the impact of climate change on coastal communities. He had the same burning passion I'd seen in Finn O'Connell in Alaska, but with an intensity that was entirely his own. When he asked what I did beyond just managing other people's money, I surprised myself by telling him the truth. I told him about my secret photography studies and my obsession with wildlife. We slipped away from the suffocating ballroom to a quiet coffee shop nearby. I nervously showed him my hidden portfolio on my laptop. He didn't just glance, he studied each image, asking questions about the light, the composition, and the emotional narrative I sought to capture. "You shouldn't be wearing that suit, Elara," he said, gesturing to my tailored designer outfit. "You should be out there, showing people what you see through that lens. In that moment, I admitted my deepest secret aloud. I want to be a professional photographer, Liam. I just don't know how to break free. The financial ties are too tight. He listened, then told me about an upcoming expedition to the Serengeti in Tanzania. An organization was looking for an additional photographer for 3 months to document endangered black rhinos and conservation efforts. Your work has that emotional quality they're seeking, he urged. You make people care about these animals. The application deadline is next week. The total cost, including specialized equipment I didn't own, would be around $25,000. It was a significant amount, and since my parents had insisted on helping me manage my professional finances, they monitored my spending closely. That night, pacing my perfectly decorated condo that felt utterly foreign, I made a decision. I applied. I worked feverishly after every soul-crushing day at Wellington, pouring my soul into the application, selecting my strongest wildlife images, and writing an impassioned statement that was entirely my own. 2 weeks later, the email arrived. I had been accepted. The expedition director specifically cited the unusual emotional depth of my portfolio as the deciding factor. Joy and terror clashed violently in my chest. This meant requesting a 3-month leave of absence from Wellington, which would surely draw my parents' immediate, furious attention, and somehow securing the money for the equipment. I decided the most logical path was to ask my parents for a loan. I was a professional with a high salary. Surely they would see this as a reasonable, even prestigious investment in their daughter's development. I prepared a detailed presentation on the expedition's prestige, the career-building aspects, and the potential PR value. I scheduled a dinner at their home, arriving with an uncharacteristic, fragile optimism. I had no idea I was walking into the confrontation that would not only shatter my optimism, but also lead to the single, most important and shocking phone call of my life. A call that would shift the tectonic plates of our family power dynamic forever. The dinner was the prelude to my own emotional detonation. The dinner was set up like a performance. The family chef prepared Dad's favorite prime rib, and Mother was basking in the glow of securing a major donation for her latest gala. I waited until dessert, a tense, calculated pause, before I dropped the news. I've been selected for a prestigious wildlife photography expedition to the Serengeti. I began, trying to keep my voice steady, professional. It's an incredible honor. They only chose 5 photographers globally. My father's spoon froze halfway to his mouth. Mother's perfect smile dissolved. Neither spoke, so I pressed on, explaining the conservation focus, the involvement of respected NGOs, and how this would establish me professionally without abandoning my finance career. I mentioned that my manager at Wellington had tentatively approved a sabbatical. The only obstacle, I concluded, sliding my carefully prepared equipment budget across the table, is the professional-grade cameras and lenses. I need to invest about $25,000 for the gear. I can repay it from my salary within the year. My mother's laugh was a brittle, sharp sound, like ice cracking. You cannot be serious, Elara. This is that ridiculous photography hobby again. I thought we moved past this childishness after Thanksgiving. It's not a hobby, Mother. It is my passion, and I'm good at it. Really good. The selection committee said my work has unusual emotional depth. My father set down his wine glass with deliberate, horrifying precision. Rhonda, you have a responsibility to the Williams name. Taking pretty pictures of animals might amuse you, but it does nothing for our legacy. Your position at Wellington is the beginning of what we have planned for you. What you have planned for me, I corrected, my voice quiet but firm, a sliver of the courage Grandpa Arthur wanted me to find. What about what I planned for myself? The tension escalated rapidly. They barely glanced at my portfolio, their expressions hardening with every rational attempt I made to bridge the two worlds. They saw the camera not as a career path, but as a personal insult to their values. Finally, I repeated the request. I need the investment for the equipment. I am asking for a loan, not a handout. An investment in what exactly? Mother snapped, her face cold. A safari vacation where you can play National Geographic photographer? We didn't raise you to chase meaningless dreams. We raised you to build on the foundation we created. A foundation I never asked for. I retorted, rising to my feet. My mother fixed me with the stare I had feared since childhood, the ultimate judgment. We are not your bank anymore, she hissed, her voice sharp with smug certainty. You have a salary. You have a trust fund you can access at 40. If you want to waste money on cameras, use your own. All my life you have used money to control me. My education, my career, my home. Nothing has ever truly been my choice, I countered, the years of bottled-up resentment finally overflowing. And look how well you've turned out. My father spat. Everything you have is because of us. No, I said, picking up my tablet. Everything I am is despite you. I left that night, their refusal, and my father's thinly veiled threat to contact Wellington's senior management ringing in my ears. As I drove back, tears blurred my vision, replaced by a deep, genuine anger. They had chosen control over connection, status over their daughter's happiness. This was not disappointment. This was a war, and I had just lost the first battle. The very next morning, before I could process the events of the night before, my phone buzzed. It was Marcus Shaw, the family lawyer, calling with devastating news. Grandpa Arthur had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The grief was a physical blow, heavy and immediate. The only person who saw me was gone. The funeral 3 days later was a blur of black suits and hushed, important voices. I noticed my parents whispering nervously, their eyes darting frequently to Marcus, the stoic lawyer. At the reception, while they were busy circulating among the Boston elite, I sat alone in the quiet garden, clutching my grief. Marcus approached me there, his formal demeanor softened by sympathy. Your grandfather spoke of you often, Miss Williams, with immense pride. He was the only one who really knew me, I whispered. He handed me a small, sealed envelope with my name written in Grandpa Arthur's distinctive, slightly shaky hand. He asked me to give you this after the service. Also, you are required at my office tomorrow at 10 a.m. regarding this date. I expected the note to be a sentimental goodbye. Instead, it contained just one powerful line. Remember your promise to be brave. I had no idea that tomorrow's meeting would be the moment I finally understood the true meaning of his rebellion, and that the tables of control were about to be turned with a shocking, devastating force. I arrived at Marcus Shaw's office the next morning to find my parents already there, tense and expectant. My father, Clark, was Arthur's only child and presumed heir. The family corporation had been sold years ago, but Grandpa Arthur's personal fortune was estimated conservatively at around $80 million. Clark was practically vibrating with nervous anticipation. Marcus Shaw entered precisely at 10, carrying a leather portfolio. After a brief expression of condolences, he got straight to the matter. I will now read the last will and testament of Arthur Charles Williams. The will began, predictably enough, 10% to various conservation charities, 10% divided among his longtime staff. Then came the twist, the seismic shift that would send shockwaves through our family. The remaining 80% of the estate, including all properties and personal possessions, is placed in a family trust with the following instructions. To my granddaughter, Elara Jane Williams, I leave the position of sole trustee with full, absolute discretionary control over all assets and distributions. The silence that followed was agonizing. My father's face was instantly drained of color, turning a ghostly white. My mother's jaw dropped in undisguised, utter shock. Marcus continued, reading the terms that included monthly allowances for Clark and Vivian, which could be adjusted at my discretion as the trustee, provided they met certain behavioral conditions outlined in a detailed appendix. "This is outrageous," Dad spluttered, finally finding his voice. "I am his son, his only child. This is some kind of mistake." "And yet," Marcus replied calmly without looking up, "Mr. Williams was of sound mind and body when he revised his will last year. His wishes, while unorthodox, are legally binding." As Marcus explained the intricacies, my parents' shock morphed into a desperate, barely contained rage. I would work with the trust manager, Anthony Rhodes, but all major decisions, including any expenditure requested by my parents beyond their established base allowance, required my final approval. My parents stormed out of Marcus's office without saying a single word to me, their fury so palpable it left a residue in the air. I stayed behind, my mind racing, trying to process the magnitude of the power I had just inherited. Marcus offered me tea and a moment of quiet. "Your grandfather was gravely concerned about your parents' values and their influence on you," he explained gently. "He saw in you a goodness and an integrity that he feared they would extinguish with their obsession with status. But why give me this power?" I stammered, overwhelmed. "I don't know the first thing about managing this kind of money." "That's what Anthony and I are here for," Marcus reassured me. "But the moral decisions, the values that guide the use of this wealth, those he trusted to you alone. He gave you the power to break the cycle." I left Marcus's office in a daze, a bizarre mix of grief, fear, and unparalleled power washing over me. On the drive back to my condo, my phone buzzed with an incoming text from Anthony Rhodes, the newly appointed trust manager. The text read, "Your parents have submitted their first request for an early monthly allowance. Amount, $20,000. Reason given, emotional distress. Approve." I pulled over immediately. The weight of this new responsibility settled onto my shoulders like a physical yoke. I thought of the dinner 2 nights ago, my mother's smug dismissal. "We are not your bank anymore." I thought of years of emotional manipulation disguised as concern. And I thought of Grandpa Arthur's final note. "Remember your promise to be brave." I typed one word and hit send. Denied. The response to my single-word text was immediate, overwhelming, and explosive. Within 20 minutes, my phone lit up like a Christmas tree. First Dad, then Mom, then their personal attorney, whom they likely called directly from Marcus Shaw's parking lot. I let every call go to voicemail, needing the crucial hour to compose myself and prepare. This was it, the uncharted, terrifying territory of standing my ground against the 2 people who had controlled my life since birth. When the doorbell rang an hour later, I took a deep, steadying breath. Clark and Vivian stood on my doorstep, their faces contorted with a mixture of rage and disbelief. They pushed past me into the living room, too agitated for common courtesy. "How dare you?" Dad hissed, his voice tight. How dare you deny our request? We raised you. We gave you everything. Mother's voice trembled with indignation. I motioned for them to sit, but they remained standing, radiating an unstable energy. For the first time, beneath the familiar layer of their anger, I saw something new and potent: fear. They were suddenly completely dependent on me, and the role reversal had shaken them to their core. $20,000 is excessive, I said, keeping my voice level, drawing strength from the memory of Grandpa Arthur, especially given our conversation the other night, when you made it quite clear you were not my bank. It seems the situation has reversed. This is different, Elara. Dad argued, his composure finally cracking. That was your frivolous photography nonsense. This is about our lifestyle, our standing in the community. A lifestyle beyond your means, apparently, I countered, using the information Marcus had quietly revealed. Sebastian showed me the financial records. You've been spending significantly more than Dad earns for years. The vacation home in Aspen, the private jet memberships, all financed by regular, generous loans from Grandpa Arthur that you never repaid. Their stunned silence confirmed the truth. My parents had been living a massive facade, projecting immense wealth while secretly relying on Grandpa Arthur's constant generosity to sustain it. They had fully expected his $80 million fortune to pass directly to Dad, wiping out their secret debts and resolving their financial overextension. Instead, they were now financially subordinate to the daughter they had just dismissed as childish. We had an understanding with my father. Dad sputtered, his face growing red again. He knew those loans were essentially advances on my inheritance. That's not what his meticulous records indicate, I replied, stepping further into my role as trustee, and clearly not what he intended with his will. Mother quickly changed tactics, deploying a sudden, calculated vulnerability I'd seen her use countless times to manipulate charity donors. Darling, we are still adjusting to the loss. Your grandfather would want us to be comfortable during this incredibly difficult time. Grandpa wanted many things, I agreed, staring directly into her calculating eyes. He wanted me to pursue photography. He wanted our family to value more than money and status. He wanted me to be brave enough to break the cycle of financial control. You cannot possibly understand the demands of maintaining our position in society, Dad dismissed, recovering some of his old arrogance. Perhaps not, I replied, allowing my voice to rise with the years of suppressed pain. But I understand what it feels like to have my dreams dismissed as frivolous while watching you spend tens of thousands on wine, golf memberships, and endless parties. The conversation continued for another hour, their demands gradually eroding into negotiations, then thin pleas, and finally, thinly veiled threats. We will contest the will, Dad declared, slamming his hand on my glass coffee table. No judge will uphold this kind of manipulation from beyond the grave. I delivered the final, non-negotiable shockwave. Marcus already prepared me for that. The will includes a no-contest clause, Dad. If you challenge it and lose, you forfeit everything. Given Grandpa Arthur's meticulously documented concerns about your financial judgment, which I now possess, your chances are not good. As they finally left, defeated and simmering with unspent rage, Mother paused at the door, her expression hard. You will regret this, Elara. Family should come first. I agree, I said quietly, holding her gaze. That is why I cannot enable the behaviors that have torn this family apart. After they were gone, I called Anthony Rhodes, the trust manager. We established a firm, reasonable monthly allowance for my parents, enough to live comfortably, but not extravagantly. Then I called Marcus Shaw. This was no longer about revenge or denial. It was about finally claiming my own path. I needed to use the power Grandpa Arthur gave me to build the life I was meant to live, starting with a 3-month sabbatical to the Serengeti. 2 days after the explosive confrontation, I sat back in Marcus Shaw's pristine office, accompanied by Anthony Rhodes, the trust manager. I was no longer the frightened daughter. I was the sole trustee, and I had a plan. First, I stated, laying out my detailed proposal, I am formally resigning from Wellington Management. Both men blinked in surprise, but I continued before they could protest. I will use a portion of the trust's liquid assets to purchase the professional camera equipment I need, the $25,000 investment my parents refused to loan me. Anthony smiled faintly. That seems a prudent use of discretionary funds for professional development, Trustee Williams. Second, I will immediately take the 3-month expedition to the Serengeti. This is not a vacation. It's the launch of my career. During this time, I want all contact with my parents managed by you, Marcus, to maintain the boundaries we've established. Third, I concluded, tapping my pen on the desk, I want to explore how the trust can be structured to support major wildlife conservation efforts. Grandpa Arthur always cared deeply about the planet. I want this wealth to honor his values, not just accumulate. Marcus nodded approvingly. Your grandfather would be very pleased, Elara. He was specifically concerned that you find your own path, not the one your parents prescribed. I looked at Anthony. I'm still trying to understand why he went to such extreme lengths. Giving me this much control seems arbitrary. Anthony opened a folder and slid a copy of a letter across the desk. This might help. It's a letter your grandfather wrote to your father 5 years ago, expressing his profound concerns about his financial decisions and lack of moral compass. Attached was my father's dismissive, defensive response, suggesting Arthur was out of touch with modern realities. There were many such exchanges, Marcus explained. Your grandfather tried for years to guide Clark toward a healthier relationship with wealth. When he saw those same toxic patterns being forced onto you, when he realized his son's priorities were fixed on status and appearance, he felt compelled to intervene with a definitive, unchallengeable action. Reading those documents solidified my resolve. This wasn't about punishing my parents. It was about breaking a generational pattern of toxic entitlement and control. Grandpa Arthur hadn't just given me financial power, he had given me the leverage to redefine what the Williams family valued. That afternoon, I submitted my formal resignation to Wellington. It was one of the most liberating actions of my life. I called Liam, confirmed my participation in the Serengeti expedition, applied for an expedited passport, and ordered the professional camera gear I had researched so thoroughly. Each action, each click of a button, felt like a declaration of independence. In the weeks that followed, my parents made several desperate, frantic attempts to regain control. They sent family friends, powerful people in Boston society, to reason with me. They tried to appeal to the board at Wellington to block my sudden departure. They attempted to contact Anthony directly, demanding access to the full accounts. Every effort failed. They were met with the quiet, firm boundary of my new authority. I was learning to say no without guilt. The night before my departure for Tanzania, I received one final text from Anthony Rhodes. Your parents have requested an additional $15,000 for a last-minute trip to Europe to recover from their emotional distress. Approve. Looking at my packed bags, the new camera equipment purchased with my decision, and the itinerary for the expedition that represented my first truly free choice, I felt an unexpected, serene calm. I typed denied without hesitation, then added a brief, personal note to Anthony to relay to them. I am leaving for the Serengeti tomorrow. I hope when I return, we can begin building a healthier relationship based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. As the plane lifted off the runway the next morning, I looked down at the familiar Boston skyline receding beneath the clouds. I felt the weight of 32 years of expectations lift from my shoulders. For the first time in my life, I was flying towards something I had chosen entirely for myself, ready to face the wild, uncertain, but necessary path ahead. The Serengeti was not just a destination. It was a purification. It was everything I had hoped for, and infinitely more. The expedition team was tight-knit. 5 photographers, 3 wildlife biologists, and a crew of local guides whose knowledge of the terrain was intimate and profound. We were immediately immersed in the intense purpose of tracking and documenting the endangered black rhino, studying their behavior, and mapping the environmental threats they faced. I woke before dawn each morning, the camera ready, the air charged with the raw energy of the plains. My heart no longer pounded with anxiety of performing, but with the focused anticipation of purpose. I was finally using the voice Grandpa Arthur had encouraged. My fellow photographers, all established professionals, initially regarded me with understandable curiosity. The former finance executive turned wildlife photographer was a narrative that sparked plenty of skeptical whispers. But as we worked side by side, my unique perspective began to earn their respect. While they focused on technical perfection and clinical distance, I sought the emotional core, waiting patiently for those fleeting moments when the animals seemed to reveal something vulnerable and almost human in their expressions. You have a genuine gift for capturing the soul, Dr. Amina, our expedition leader and senior biologist, told me after reviewing my shots of a mother elephant protecting her calf. Most photographers take years to develop that sensitivity. Yours is innate. Away from the sterile, judgmental environment of Boston society, I began to transform. The Elara who had been trapped in the Burberry suit and the corner office began to fade. I became more confident in voicing my opinions during scientific discussions. I learned to trust my instincts about light and composition rather than second-guessing every choice. I discovered a physical resilience I never knew I possessed, hiking for miles in intense heat with heavy gear, driven solely by the need to capture a specific moment. I maintained a strict emotional distance from my family. Each week, I sent selected photographs to Marcus Shaw, who managed the minimal, necessary communication with my parents. Their initial response had been frigid silence, punctuated by a few legal threats that Marcus swiftly dismissed. But by the end of the first month, Marcus reported a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. My mother, Vivian, had tentatively asked to see some of my work. A week later, my father, Clark, inquired about my well-being during a particularly intense rainy season. They were searching for a point of connection that wasn't financial. Midway through the expedition, Liam Scott joined us, spending 2 weeks covering the conservation side of our efforts for a major environmental magazine. Seeing him again, in this environment where I was utterly and authentically myself, sparked a connection that went beyond mutual interest. He valued me for the dirt on my boots and the focus in my eyes, not the name on my bank account. "You look different," Liam observed one evening as we watched a pride of lions against a spectacular sunset. "More alive." The anxiety is gone. I feel different, I admitted, looking out at the vast, wild plain. Like I'm finally the person I was meant to be. I'm not performing anymore. The climax of the trip arrived on my final night. Dr. Amina announced that National Geographic had seen some of my early submissions and expressed immediate, strong interest in featuring a series of my photographs in their upcoming issue, a piece focusing specifically on the emotional lives of endangered species. My team toasted my success, and for the first time in my life, I accepted the genuine praise without deflection or discomfort. That night, lying in my tent, listening to the deep, resonant calls of the wild, I composed a single email to my former boss at Wellington Management. It was concise and professional. I was respectfully resigning from my position. It was time to commit fully to the path I had discovered, to honor my gift rather than bury it beneath expectations that had never been my own. I was trading a life of predictable wealth for a life of unpredictable purpose. And I was finally ready to face the consequences and the long overdue, difficult work of redefining my relationships back home. I returned to Boston 3 months later as a different person. I was deeply tanned, physically resilient, and absolutely clear about my boundaries and my purpose. The Elara who left was defined by fear. The Elara who returned was defined by the lens. The first meeting with my parents was tense, staged in my Beacon Hill condo that still felt like their choice, not mine. They sat stiffly, examining the large prints I had displayed on the walls, my Serengeti portfolio. Their expressions were a careful mix of reluctant admiration and lingering resentment, a silent war of conflicting emotions. National Geographic, my mother, Vivian, said finally, touching the magazine that featured my striking image of a black rhino. I suppose that is quite prestigious. It was the closest she had ever come to an olive branch. It is, I agreed, accepting the small concession without needing to seek her approval. I explained my immediate plans. The conservation organization had already commissioned me for follow-up documentation around the world. I was planning exhibitions in New York and London. My father, Clark, frowned, clinging to the last vestige of his controlling mindset. And how exactly will you support yourself? Photography is hardly a stable career. I calmly laid out the new financial reality which I had finalized with Anthony Rhodes. The trust will provide me with a modest, fixed income to cover basic living and project development costs. I will live primarily on my photography earnings. As for your allowance, I continued, addressing the elephant in the room directly, it remains as previously established, reasonable, not excessive. If you wish to maintain your current lifestyle, Dad will need to continue working rather than taking the early retirement you planned. They bristled at this definitive reality check, but they did not argue. The power dynamic was fundamentally, irreversibly shifted, and they knew that challenging the trustee meant risking everything. I knew I couldn't build my new life in their shadow. I contacted a realtor and put the Beacon Hill condo on the market. With Liam's quiet support, I began searching for a studio and a home in a different neighborhood, one that valued art and character over lineage. Before they left my condo that day, I handed them an invitation to my first official gallery opening in Boston the following month. I would like you to be there, I said sincerely, not as financial backers or to make connections, but simply as my parents, to see what I have created. The weeks that followed were filled with the invigorating purpose of building my life from the ground up. I rented a light-filled studio in an artistic neighborhood far from my childhood bubble. I hired an assistant to manage the burgeoning interest in my work. Liam and I began dating in earnest, a relationship free from the parental vetting and judgment that had poisoned my past. My first gallery opening exceeded all expectations. The space was packed with conservation advocates, serious collectors, and media representatives. My parents arrived exactly on time, impeccably dressed, but visibly uncomfortable in this unfamiliar, vibrant world. They stood before a striking, enlarged print, an aging male lion, gazing directly into the camera with an expression of profound, tired dignity. "I never understood," my mother said quietly, studying the image, "why this matters so much to you." "Because it is truth, mother," I replied, stepping beside her. "Not the surface we present to the world, but what lies beneath. That is what I try to capture." By the end of the evening, almost 3/4 of my photographs had sold, with a percentage dedicated to wildlife conservation. My father watched as collectors and critics eagerly discussed my technique and vision. For the first time, I glimpsed a flicker of profound uncertainty in his eyes, the realization that his narrow definition of success might be far more limited than he had ever believed. As the months passed, our family dynamic slowly, awkwardly evolved. My parents, forced to adapt to their new financial reality, sold the expansive Beacon Hill mansion and downsized to a beautiful, yet less ostentatious townhouse. My father, instead of sinking into a resentful early retirement, found a renewed purpose in mentoring young, talented financial professionals, discovering a genuine talent for teaching he had never explored. My mother resigned from several of her society charity boards and focused intensely on one cause she truly cared about: arts education for underprivileged children. The toxic financial control that had defined us for decades was gone, leaving behind a complex, fragile space where a healthier relationship might finally begin to grow. The first year following Grandpa Arthur's death, and my return, was undeniably the hardest. It was marked by a painstaking, slow evolution in my relationship with my parents. The anger gave way to resentment, which, over time, softened into cautious communication. There were still angry phone calls, guilt-laden emails, and holidays where the tension made every interaction feel like walking through a minefield. But the power dynamic, the ability to manipulate with money, was irrevocably broken. The turning point was subtle, occurring 18 months after I was named trustee. Liam and I invited my parents to dinner at the charming Victorian home I had purchased in Cambridge, just 3 blocks from Grandpa Arthur's old place. It was a home I had chosen and paid for with my own money and modest trust assistance, a space that was authentically mine. My father, Clark, had been unusually quiet throughout the meal. As my mother, Vivian, was serving coffee, he finally spoke, turning a letter over and over in his hands. "I received this today," he said, his voice hesitant. "It's from a young analyst I've been mentoring. He wrote to thank me for helping him understand a complex market analysis. But then he said something that struck me." He looked up at me, a flicker of genuine vulnerability in his eyes, a look I had rarely seen directed at me. He said I was the first senior executive who had ever taken the time to explain rather than simply demand. He paused, taking a slow breath. "It made me think about how I raised you, Elara. Always demanding, never explaining. Always judging, never simply seeing." "Harold," my mother began, using his rarely heard first name as a warning. "No, Vivian, I need to say this." He turned back to me, the vulnerable look fixed. "I was raised to believe that success had a very specific, narrow definition. When you chose a different path, I saw it as a rejection of everything I valued. But watching you these past months, seeing what you have built entirely on your own, your work, your conviction, I was wrong. and I am sorry. The simplicity of the apology, so long overdue, so unexpected, brought immediate tears to my eyes. It wasn't a total transformation, but it was a crucial beginning, an acknowledgement that perhaps their way wasn't the only way. My own healing journey was equally complex. With Marcus's encouragement, I started therapy 6 months after returning from the Serengeti. I had to systematically work through the deep-seated, people-pleasing tendencies and insecurities that years of conditional love had instilled. I learned to recognize when I was making choices to earn approval rather than because they aligned with my values. I practiced setting boundaries without feeling guilty and expressing my needs without fear of retribution. The trust became a tool for growth, not control. Working with Anthony, I structured the family finances to provide stability while actively encouraging independence. My parents received their monthly allowance without needing to request it, which removed the power dynamic of approval or denial. For myself, I maintained a strict separation between my personal earnings and the trust assets. I needed to know that I could support myself entirely through my photography, ensuring I hadn't simply replaced one form of financial dependency with another. Liam became the cornerstone of my new life. His straightforward approach to everything, relationships, finance, life, was a refreshing change from the toxic complexity I had known. When he moved in, we discussed money openly, splitting expenses proportionally, making decisions as true, equal partners. A year after the successful launch of my career, I established the Arthur Charles Williams Conservation Photography Fellowship. It provided crucial funding and mentorship for emerging photographers focused on environmental issues. It was the perfect way to honor Grandpa Arthur's true legacy, not through the accumulation of wealth or status, but by creating opportunities for others to pursue their passion and purpose, just as he had done for me. I had finally learned that the greatest legacy isn't what you keep, but what you enable others to create. 2 years had passed since that shocking dinner where my mother smugly declared, "We are not your bank anymore." My life had transformed from a gilded cage to an open horizon. My wildlife photography career had flourished, securing 3 international exhibitions, a major book deal, and regular assignments from prestigious conservation organizations. More importantly, I woke up every morning with a profound sense of purpose and excitement. The internal journey, however, required constant vigilance. There were still days when the critical, internalized voices of my parents whispered that I was being foolish or selfish. But those voices grew fainter with each success, each moment of authentic joy I experienced behind the lens. On the 2nd anniversary of Grandpa Arthur's passing, I invited my parents to dinner at my Cambridge home. The location was deliberate, a neighborhood that valued history and character over ostentatious status. As we sat in my dining room, surrounded by large prints from my travels, the atmosphere was strikingly different from the formal, constrained dinners of my childhood. The conversation flowed more naturally, focused on genuine curiosity rather than landmines. My father asked complex, detailed questions about my latest project documenting climate change impacts on coastal communities. My mother admired a series of portraits I had taken of Indigenous conservation leaders, noting the dignity I had managed to capture in their expressions. After dinner, I brought out a special bottle of wine and 3 letters Grandpa Arthur had written before his death, one for each of us, to be opened on this anniversary. We read them in silence, absorbing his final words of wisdom. My letter reminded me that true wealth was measured not in dollars, but in purpose, connection, and courage. "You have these in abundance, Elara," he wrote. Use them wisely, not just for yourself, but as a light for others who need to see that different paths are possible. My father didn't share the contents of his letter, but I watched him carefully wipe away tears before folding it precisely and placing it inside his jacket pocket. My mother's hands trembled as she read hers. When she finished, she looked at me with new, genuine understanding. "He was very proud of you, Elara," she said softly, her voice heavy with regret and acceptance. "Not just of what you might accomplish, but of who you are." I see now what he saw. Later, as they prepared to leave, Dad paused before an enlarged photograph I had taken in the Serengeti, the young lioness standing at the edge of the vast plain, gazing toward the horizon with clear-eyed determination. "This one is special to you," he observed, no longer a question, but a recognition. "She reminds me to keep moving forward," I replied, "to not be defined by the past." He nodded thoughtfully, running a finger along the frame. "Your work is remarkable, Elara. Truly, I may not have understood your choice, but I cannot deny your talent." Coming from him, that simple, long-awaited acknowledgement meant more than all the accolades from critics and collectors. It wasn't because I still needed his approval, but because it represented growth, his and mine. As I closed the door behind them, I felt a deep sense of peace. The journey from financial control to genuine independence had been difficult and painful, but necessary. I had learned that money could be a prison or a tool, depending on how we related to it, that wealth without purpose was ultimately empty, and that standing in your truth might cost relationships, but living a lie definitely costs your soul. Most importantly, I had discovered that breaking cycles of toxic financial dependency requires more than just financial freedom. It demands emotional liberation, the courage to define success on your own terms, and the wisdom to use resources as bridges rather than weapons. I finally had the freedom to frame my own life, thanks to the quiet, courageous rebellion of a loving old man. My path belongs to me alone, and I wouldn't trade that for all the money in Beacon Hill. Thanks for listening my story.